My husband bragged about selling my cabin for $60,000 while I was overseas, then he learned what he'd really given away for pennies. In the quiet moments before chaos erupted, she carried a secret, not one of infidelity, but of self-preservation, meticulously woven into the very fabric of her life. She knew her husband had a knack for misjudgment, but she never imagined he would mistake a federal asset for a casual transaction. Learne Vance had just endured a 14-hour flight from Singapore, followed by 2 delayed connections, and had arrived home only 4 hours earlier. Her husband, Arthur Blackwood, had insisted she come straight to his parents' home for dinner, deeming the gathering important. She should have known that important rarely meant good when it came to Arthur. The announcement came while everyone was still savoring the first course. Arthur stood, his wine glass held aloft, a self-satisfied grin plastered across his face. He loved to command a room, especially when he believed he was its most fascinating occupant. "You all remember Ilara's little cabin," he began, pausing for dramatic effect, a theatrical beat designed to heighten anticipation for whatever grand revelation he was about to make. Her rather impractical purchase from 3 years ago. His mother, Eleanor, matriarch of the Blackwood table, let out a soft, knowing laugh, her good pearls gleaming under the dining room lights. His father, Robert, offered a slow, approving nod, a silent endorsement of his son's supposed wisdom. Julian, Arthur's younger brother, leaned back, a conspiratorial smirk playing on his lips, clearly in on the joke. "I sold it," Arthur declared, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Ilara, while she was overseas. "For $60,000. The room erupted in applause. Eleanor clapped politely, a measured performance of enthusiasm she reserved for what she considered significant events. Robert beamed, murmuring, "That's my boy," his tone dripping with the satisfaction of a father whose son had finally delivered something worth bragging about. Julian let out a low whistle. Arthur gestured grandly at the table, laden with the roast, fine wine, and the tiramisu Eleanor had undoubtedly spent the afternoon perfecting. "This dinner," he announced, "it's all thanks to the cabin sale. At least one meal is covered." He directed a smug smile at Ilara, the kind he used when he thought he'd fixed a problem she hadn't known existed. The family chuckled, a wave of laughter that seemed to mock the cabin, the sale, and Ilara herself. Ilara's phone vibrated in her pocket. She kept her face perfectly impassive, a skill honed over 6 years of practice, maintaining composure as significant events unfolded around her. She discreetly picked up her wine glass. "That's something," she managed, her voice carefully neutral. Arthur, preening, settled back into his seat and launched into a detailed explanation of his investment plans for the remaining $59,000, directing his monologue at Robert. Under the table, Ilara glanced at her phone. An unfamiliar number, Mr. Davies, attorney at law. And then, a text message that had arrived 2 hours earlier, while her plane was still descending over the Pacific, from a number she recognized instantly. "Special Agent Miller, aware of situation regarding your Pine Grove property. Maintain normal behavior. Attend family dinner as planned. Keep subjects unaware. Team mobilizing." Ilara flipped her phone face down on her thigh. Across the table, Arthur was expounding on real estate investment strategies with the unshakable confidence of a man who believed he had just definitively proven his genius. Through the curtains, she could see the driveway, still empty. But not for long. The cabin. The cabin was the genesis of everything. And what Arthur dismissed as impractical was, in fact, the most prudent decision Ilara had ever made. Ilara Vance was 38. For the past 11 years, she'd worked as a compliance analyst, recently promoted to senior field consultant for a government-adjacent private contractor. The details of her work were bound by an ironclad NDA, one she respected deeply. What she could say was that her job involved international regulatory compliance, had taken her to 14 countries in 6 years, and that 3 years ago, when her security clearance was renewed and her assignment profile upgraded, the implications for her personal assets changed dramatically. The cabin was nestled in Pine Grove, Washington, 2 acres of majestic Douglas firs, a creek running cold and clear from March to October. She'd purchased it for $38,000 at an estate sale, drawn by its remoteness, its authenticity, and the profound sense of ownership that comes from making a choice entirely independent of anyone else's opinion. Arthur had labeled it impractical from day one. What he truly meant was, "I don't see the value," or, "This doesn't reflect well on us." Beneath all that, it was the same underlying message: "This is yours, not mine, and that makes me uncomfortable." She had bought it anyway, using a consulting bonus earned before their marriage, meticulously kept in a separate account. By training and temperament, Elara was a person who maintained clear documentation of what belonged to whom. The security clearance upgrade occurred in January of the year she went to Singapore. Her compliance officer, Mr. Chen, a 24-year veteran of federal contractor security, explained the asset registration requirement with the precise language of someone who needed absolute clarity. "Any real property owned by personnel at your clearance level needs to be registered in the Federal Asset Database," he stated. "This is not discretionary. It flags the property as a secured asset. Any attempt to transfer it triggers automatic notification through multiple channels." "What kind of transfer?" Elara asked. "Sale, deed change, title modification." "Any of it," Mr. Chen replied, his gaze steady. "The database is watched. Any irregularity is flagged immediately." Elara registered the cabin in February. Utilities were automated, a property management company hired, and security cameras installed. Standard protocol, Mr. Chen had reassured her, for registered assets of any kind. She had informed Arthur that the cabin was handled for her absence, but she never divulged the specifics. The specifics were under NDA, and over 6 years, Arthur had consistently shown a tendency to use any information she shared primarily for his own benefit. In March, she left for Singapore. In April, Arthur found the deed. To understand Arthur, one had to think of him like a force of nature. Not a warning, exactly, but an explanation for every decision made within his orbit. Arthur Blackwood was 41. He was handsome, in that effortless, well-maintained way of men perpetually told they are the smartest in the room, internalizing it as a permanent license rather than a provisional assessment. He worked in commercial real estate development, not as a developer himself, but as a facilitator, advisor, and fee-taker, a legitimate profession where he was genuinely skilled when applying himself to others' projects. For his own ventures, however, his skills often misfired. Of their 3 significant financial decisions together, one had been successful. The other 2 had failed spectacularly, costing them a combined $140,000, the way bad real estate decisions always do, slowly, then suddenly, with a deceptive period of false hope in between. After the second failure, Elara had quietly restructured her finances into a separate arrangement Arthur knew existed but whose details he didn't possess. Some might call it controlling, Elara called it prudent, especially after 6 years of watching someone gamble with your money. She wouldn't pretend she hadn't known who Arthur was when she married him. She did. But she'd clung to the hopeful belief that the charming version she saw in their early years was his true self, and the other, less pleasant one, a product of temporary circumstances. The circumstances hadn't changed. The less pleasant version became dominant. By the time she left for Singapore, Elara had already consulted a divorce attorney, Sarah Jenkins, a 17-year veteran of family law who asked 3 crucial questions before any others and listened intently. Their consultations were preliminary. Elara was doing what she did best professionally, documenting, building a comprehensive financial picture before making any final decisions. She was in compliance mode. She had not, however, anticipated Arthur accelerating her timeline quite so dramatically. The safe was in her home office, a fireproof combination safe designed for documents, not valuables. Gerald Chen had advised her that for someone with her security clearance, concentrated valuables in the home were a liability. The combination was the date she and Arthur had first met, a detail she'd set 3 years prior, still in the phase where shared dates held romantic significance. Arthur, at dinner, had told Julian the combination was their anniversary. Close enough, it seemed. Same month, different year. He'd stumbled upon the correct combination while practicing with a slightly wrong date, the kind of undeserved luck some people occasionally find. He had found the deed. He then spent 3 days practicing Ilara's signature, copying from her old journals. This detail was crucial. It wasn't impulsive. He had identified the correct documents, practiced meticulously, and gained confidence. This was not an impulsive act, she thought. This was a plan. The V in Ilara was tilted wrong, Arthur had proudly recounted to Julian, but I got the pressure right. He had forged her signature on the transfer documents, found a buyer through his real estate network, and sold a federally registered secured asset for $60,000, approximately $22,000 below its assessed value, a clear indication of his sloppy research into the transaction. The federal database had flagged the transfer the moment it processed. Ilara hadn't known about the flag immediately. She was in Singapore, documenting regulatory non-compliance in a facility that would have given Gerald Chen a professional crisis, fully immersed in her work. She learned about the flag from Agent Miller, her contact during her clearance renewal, who had texted her 2 hours before she landed with instructions. Ilara followed them without question, trusting Agent Miller's consistently sound judgment. Maintain normal behavior. Attend family dinner as planned. Keep subjects unaware. Team mobilizing. Reading that text at 34,000 feet over the Pacific, Ilara hadn't been surprised. Only a grim confirmation of something she'd partially expected. She took a deep breath, mentally preparing for the next 4 hours, then closed her eyes and slept. She'd learned long ago that exhaustion compromises performance, and what was coming required nothing less than perfection. The call from Mr. Davies, the buyer's attorney, came at 7:42 p.m. While Arthur was explaining the nuances of short-term versus long-term real estate investment to Robert, Ilara excused herself to the porch. The late October night in Washington was cold, a biting presence that felt clarifying. Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Davies's voice crackled, betraying a composure he clearly practiced but was currently failing to maintain. I represent the buyers for the Pine Grove property transaction. Yes, Ilara responded calmly. There are federal financial investigators at our office, he said, a palpable pause. They've seized files. They're describing it as flagged property, restricted asset status, forged transfer documents. They're using words I don't. This isn't a situation I've encountered before, and I need to understand, Mr. Davies, Ilara interjected, her voice even, I didn't authorize the sale. More silence. I was in Singapore, she continued. The cabin is a registered federal asset. The signature on the transfer documents is not mine. I assume you're going to want to cooperate with the investigation. We had no knowledge, he began, his voice strained. I know you didn't, Ilara said. That's going to matter. She returned inside. Arthur was now enthusiastically describing a Scottsdale property he'd scouted to Julian. The tiramisu had been served, and Eleanor was refilling wine glasses. Ilara resumed her seat at the far end of the table, her usual spot, like an afterthought, distant from the main conversation. She picked up her dessert fork. The tiramisu was excellent. Eleanor made exceptional tiramisu. Ilara was halfway through her second bite when the first black vehicle turned into the driveway. Watching those who've underestimated you confront the consequences isn't the triumph you might expect. It's something far more nuanced and complex. It's the quiet satisfaction of witnessing a long-predicted inevitability arrive, tracked with the same professional detachment one gives to any complex system approaching a point of failure. Through the curtains, she watched, first vehicle, government plates, just as Agent Miller had described. A black SUV, deliberately inconspicuous. Then a second, and a third. 6 figures emerged, moving with the coordinated calm of professionals who'd performed this choreography countless times. Agent Miller led the way. Elara recognized her posture before she could even discern her face, the precise uprightness of someone who considers their bearing an extension of their professional instrument. Arthur was still explaining the Scottsdale property's cap rate to Julian. "I'll get the door," Elara offered. He barely looked up. She crossed Eleanor's polished hardwood floors, bought during a renovation 2 years ago that Arthur had loudly taken credit for suggesting but contributed nothing financially toward. She opened the front door before Agent Miller could knock. Their eyes met. "Are all subjects present?" Agent Miller asked, her voice quiet, professional, like someone reading from a carefully prepared checklist. "Dining room," Elara replied. "Having dessert?" Agent Miller nodded once. The team entered. 6 pairs of federal footsteps moved across the hardwood, heading toward the dining room with the unhurried pace of those who know every exit is covered, every variable assessed, and only the delivery remains. Arthur's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, the tiramisu suspended for a beat before slowly, inevitably, sliding off and landing on the tablecloth. Eleanor's hand flew to her pearls. Robert's face registered a blank shock, a rapid recalculation, a frantic search for dignity in a moment where its scaffolding had been abruptly removed. Julian simply stared. "Owen Blackwood," Agent Miller announced, raising her badge under Eleanor's chandelier. "Special Agent Catherine Miller, 12 years with the Federal Financial Crimes Task Force." This was the woman whose professional calm Elara had witnessed during 2 clearance renewals and 1 extremely tense deposition. "You are being taken into custody in connection with wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy related to the unauthorized transfer of a federally registered secured asset." Arthur stood, his chair scraping loudly across the hardwood, a sound Eleanor would likely relive for years. "It was a property deal," he stammered, "a simple real estate transaction." His voice held the quality of a man deploying a pre-rehearsed explanation, only to discover it entirely unfit for the situation. "Selling federally registered property using forged documents," Agent Miller stated, her tone even, like reciting a legal definition, "is not a simple transaction." He was being resourceful. Eleanor cried. This stopped Elara for a moment. Resourceful, as if resourcefulness were a defense. As if the elaborate steps, the safe combination, the practiced signature, the found deed, the buyer located through his network, somehow justified the act itself. This was the specific logic of a family that had spent 40 years reframing Arthur's choices as virtues, not yet grasping that such reframing only worked within the confines of a room where everyone already agreed. This room, however, had new occupants. Robert attempted to rise. One of the agents, a younger man, calm and precisely positioned for such a contingency, quietly said, "Please remain seated." Robert sank back down. The forged documents were right there on the table. Arthur had brought them to dinner, perhaps to show his family, to provide proof for his triumphant toast, to have the physical artifact of his accomplishment present for his celebration. He had spread them on the sideboard before dinner, shown them to Julian, let Eleanor hold the transfer paperwork. An agent photographed them in situ, the forged documents, the dinner spread, the half-eaten tiramisu, the wine glasses still raised from the recent toast. A complete document of a celebration, evidence and celebration, all in the same frame. Arthur turned to Elara. She watched him cycle through the predictable stages she'd observed over 6 years, confusion first, then the frantic recalculation, the desperate search for an explanation that would reframe the unfolding reality. Then came the anger, brief and hot, the fury of a man whose plan had collided with reality and who needed someone to blame. Finally, desperation. Elara, his voice dropped, not from composure, but from the distinct deflation of a performer facing an unappreciative audience. Tell them this is a misunderstanding. You're my wife. Elara looked at him. 6 years of silence. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but of someone who had learned that speaking into that particular room yielded no results, and who had therefore ceased trying. Arthur had always mistaken her silence for surrender. For the first time, it wasn't. She said nothing. What came after, that's where the true story resides. Owen was taken into custody that night. Agent Miller's team moved efficiently, without drama. He was processed, booked, and released on a bond his parents spent most of the following day arranging. Mr. Davies's firm cooperated fully with investigators, a correct decision he'd clearly made before hanging up with Elara on the porch. The buyers, a retired couple from Tacoma who had been genuinely excited about a property with a creek, were extricated from the transaction with the assistance of their own attorney and the federal investigation. They lost their closing costs but were compensated through a process Elara wouldn't detail, except to say that Mr. Chen's office had anticipated such possibilities and structured the asset registration accordingly. The property was returned to Elara's name, or rather, it had never truly left her name. The transfer had been flagged and frozen before finalization, precisely what happens when one attempts to sell a federal asset with a forged signature in an era of automated database monitoring. Arthur had been very precise about the signature pressure. He had not been precise about what he was signing. Sarah Jenkins, Elara's family law attorney, the woman who had been building a case with Elara for months, filed the divorce petition the following week. The wire fraud charge, the forgery charge, and the conspiracy charge, added when the investigation expanded to include Julian's foreknowledge of the sale, created a legal landscape Sarah described as clarifying. Clarifying? Elara had asked. For asset division purposes, Sarah replied, among other things. Elara appreciated the precision. Mr. Chen called 2 days after the dinner. He possessed the unique quality of a man who never says, I told you so, because he considers the facts sufficient on their own. The system worked, he stated. The system worked, Elara echoed. I'm glad you completed the registration before you left. So am I, Elara said. In the 4 months she was in Singapore, she hadn't fully grasped how glad she would be. She moved back into her own apartment, one she'd quietly maintained on a lease solely in her name, unknown to Arthur. There were some lessons from compliance training more personally useful than professionally so, and always maintain a secured exit was one of them. The cabin was still hers. She drove the 4 hours there in November, 2 weeks after everything, coffee in the cup holder, radio playing softly. When she turned onto the property road and saw the creek through the trees, she felt something she couldn't quite name. Not triumph, not exactly relief. More like a return, an arrival at something that had been patiently waiting. She sat on the porch for a long time. The creek ran cold and clear. The Douglas firs held their ground, majestic and indifferent to the drama that had unfolded below them, permanent and unwavering. She had bought this property with money predating her marriage for a reason she couldn't have fully articulated at the time. It had turned out to be the most important thing she owned, not for its appreciated value of $82,000, but because it was hers, specifically and demonstrably hers, enforced by systems far larger than anything Arthur had ever considered. He had found the deed in her safe. He had practiced her signature for 3 days. He had sold a federally registered secured asset and announced the proceeds at a family dinner before the transaction had even cleared federal monitoring. And then he had looked at her across a dining room table and said, "You're my wife," as if that were the relevant variable. As if the relevant variable were anything other than the fact that what he had sold was not his to sell, had never been his to sell, and had been registered in systems whose existence he hadn't thought to inquire about, because he had spent 6 years not asking her things. He had looked at her silence and seen surrender. He had been wrong about that for 6 years. He found out on a Thursday night over tiramisu, with 3 federal vehicles in the driveway and Agent Miller standing under the chandelier. Some corrections are proportional to the error. This one was. Agent Miller called in December with a case update. The charges had proceeded to indictment. Arthur's attorney, Stephen Thorne, a 20-year veteran of white-collar criminal defense whom Sarah Jenkins described as good, but working with a difficult client, had entered preliminary negotiations. Julian's charge had been reduced in exchange for cooperation. Robert and Eleanor were not charged, but had provided depositions which, judging by Agent Miller's tone, had not been comfortable experiences. "How are you?" Agent Miller asked before hanging up, the kind of question that offers an opportunity to say something beyond fine, especially from someone who witnessed the event and understood its aftermath. "Clear," Elara said. "I feel clear." Agent Miller was quiet for a moment. "The registration saved you," she finally said. "If the transfer had gone through before we flagged it, the recovery would have been significantly more complicated." "I know," Elara replied. "Mr. Chen is very thorough." "He is," Agent Miller agreed. "That's why I listened to him." Agent Miller laughed, a brief, genuine sound, the laugh of someone so long professional that authentic amusement feels mildly surprising. "Take care of yourself," she said. "I will," Elara responded, and meant it with the conviction of someone who had been taking care of herself all along without fully acknowledging it, who had just watched the system she built hold up under pressure, and who had emerged with a profound understanding she likely knew before, but could now state plainly: the silence was never surrender. It was patience. It was documentation. It was a federal asset registration, and a divorce attorney, and a separate apartment on a lease in her name, and a cabin in the Douglas firs with a creek that ran cold and clear from March to October. It was everything she had built while he was busy deciding that what was hers was available to be taken. He was wrong about that. He found out in the dining room.